Essays on the Active Powers of Man by Thomas Reid. Part 1, Chapters 1 and 2. What is active power? We have two words that need to be unpacked, active and power. Since active is the modifier, let us start with power. So what is power? To Reid, this concept is undefinable. I don't know what Reid means by defining something, because right after saying this, he proceeds to doing something that in my book seems like a definition. Maybe he has a very rigorous understanding of it, like those definitions used in mathematics and geometry, but like I said, I don't know, this is just me speculating. Anyhow, here's what Reid has to say about power. 1. It is part of our common sense. Power is not something we perceive, that being our external senses or self-consciousness, our ability to perceive activity inside our own minds. Since we're talking about our senses and self-consciousness, both are examples of power. One is the power to perceive external stuff, the other internal stuff. Perceiving is that which we can observe, and from the perceiving operation, save this word in your pocket, we infer the power of perceiving. In Reid's words, every operation of the mind is the exertion of some power of the mind, and we are conscious of the operation only. The power lies behind the scene. So how can we infer something that was never present to our mind? How do we even have a notion of power to infer to from the operations of our minds? Reid answers that we have very early from our constitution a conviction or belief of some degree of active power in ourselves. So the notion of power is part of our native and universal set of common sense principles. Since we have this notion in us from a very early age, we can infer propositions that contain it and, in that way, believe that this or that has powers. 2. It is a relative notion. Power is a relative notion in contrast with direct notions. So, what is the difference between relative and direct notions? The first concerns conceptions that characterize things in relation to other things, whereas the second concerns conceptions that characterize things in themselves. Examples for the first kind is the notion of body. We cannot conceive body in itself, but we can conceive it relative to its properties, that being extended, solid, and divisible. If the skeptic presses about what is the body in itself, Reid doesn't even know what the skeptic is talking about, since there is no other way to conceive what body is other than by enumerating these properties. In the case of power, we can only say that it is relative to its operations. Power X is that which, once exerted, produces Y. That is, whenever we talk of power, we always bring in mind its operations. There's no pure power. What about direct notions? Reid tells us that the properties of body are examples of it. What is extension or hardness? We cannot list any subsequent properties of these properties. Our notion of them is raw. We think of them, and what they point to in reality comes forth directly. Of these, we have a direct and immediate knowledge from our senses. Under this head, Reid also introduces us to the parallel between power and operation on one side and cause and effect on the other. The power is the cause of the operation being the effect. 3. It is a property. Power is also a property of things. Things have powers to do this and that, but powers don't exist apart from the things that have them. Powers also vary in degree and kind. This or that much of power, this or that type of power. 4. Non-observation doesn't imply non-existence. Since we must infer powers from the observation of their operations, two implications follow. We cannot infer the non-existence of a power from the lack of observation, and we cannot infer the lack or abundance of power from the operation observed. We cannot infer from the lack of observation that a certain stationary engine has no power output, and from a partial observation of an engine working, we cannot infer it has no more horsepower than that amount observed. 5. Doesn't have an opposite. There is no opposite of power. Or there's power, or there's not. It's not like big and small, full and empty, etc. In one sentence, a power is something hidden from our perception, but we can infer it from observed operations, though with limitations. That is, it's not clear how much or how little that power can produce. So what about active? What kind of power is the active power? Reid says that he needs to distinguish two big classes of human powers. There are the intellective, such as perception, reason, and memory, but there are also powers related to action, to do things outside of ourselves. These are the active powers. Reid puts it like this: the power of executing any work of art or labor is active power. This little description already makes the active powers quite exotic. That is, very hard to find anywhere outside human beings. By art, I think Reid is using the word as it was regularly used in his day, which is doing something according to method, and therefore carpentry is an art, but also agriculture or even seafaring. Now, a minute ago we talked about power and operations, and so what is the operation of the active powers? It's action, says Reid. This is the name we give to the effects of the active powers. However, Reid starts muddying the waters for us. Until this point, it has been very clear that active power is intelligent in source, since its operations are artful, that is, they require design. But now he adds this: and as every action produces some change, so every change must be caused by some exertion, or by the cessation of some exertion of power. It's not clear at all that all change must be preceded by an intelligent action. When a deer picks lichen from trees, he's causing a change in the world, and that wasn't the product of an intelligent act. But that aside, it seems Reid is committing a quantification fallacy here. Let us focus on this phrase. Every action produces some change, so every change must be caused by some exertion. Let A stand for action, C for change, and P the relation of production. What Reid said here can be translated as: if for all x and for some y, if x is an action and y is a change, therefore x produces y. That is, all x produces some y. Therefore, conclusion of an argument, not material implication, for some x and for all y, if x is an action and y is a change, therefore x produces y, or some x produces all y. This quantification fallacy actually has a name. It's the quantifier shift fallacy. The conclusion does not follow from the premise, which is true. It's true that every intelligent action produces change, but not all change is produced by an intelligent action. What an avoidable basic error this was, and it will have great and grievous consequences to Reid's system. Reid goes on stating clearly the parallel he made previously between power operation and cause-effect. That which produces a change by the exertion of its power, we call the cause of that change, and the change produced the effect of that cause. If we follow how Reid has been defining things, it follows from here that every change must have, as a cause, some intelligent action. An intelligent action can only come from active powers, which is an intelligent source or cause. But as we've seen, this is not clear at all, and Reid even tripped in a very basic fallacy reasoning about this matter. Now, the being acted on is called passive. The other, expectably, is called active. After this remark, he adds nothing more of interest, and we move into the second chapter. The second chapter, Reid picks this last subject concerning being, active and passive, that is, that which is exerting its power and that which is being acted on. He says that this distinction is universal among mankind, and we have evidence of that in the linguistic systems. According to Reid, all language has ways to accommodate the passive voice. This is a big claim. It is hard for me to believe that Reid had enough data with him to make such a wide generalization, but the truth is, he's probably right. I didn't find anything that falsifies this claim, not a single counterexample. That is, a language with no way to express the passive voice. Reid anticipates an objection anyway, that there are some uses of the passive voice grammar that is actually active, that is, a wrong use of the language. This suggesting that not being a universal fact, it is not an original distinction of our natural cognition, but rather some mix of accidental circumstances. Reid's answer is fourfold. 1. Reid notes that it is odd to classify as fortuitous something that is systematic or subject to rule. He acknowledges that we can find examples of anomalies in grammar in many languages, but these anomalies are accounted precisely by being exceptions to the rule. In this case, it is precisely because the rule is for all languages to have proper ways to express the passive voice that the objector can identify the existence of wrong uses of the passive voice to express the active voice. So these exceptions are no problem at all, but rather further confirms Reid's induction. 2. Reid also notes something that is implied in 1, which is that these wrong or strange ways to use the passive voice are simply a reassignment of purpose. He explains this by the fact that the use of language is frugal, that is, people just don't start inventing new grammar and words. They try to use old forms to express new pressing meanings. This is also true. Everyone that studies a bit of etymology can confirm this phenomena of reassigning words, phrases, or syntactic structures to new purposes. 3. People also can just be wrong about the facts. People might think X is active when it really is passive. In this case, the wrong use of the active voice is explained not by the lack of linguistic proficiency of the speaker, but by his or her inability to ascertain what's real. And Reid further points out that people really do have a tendency to find too much agency or active power in the way he defined, which is the power to produce intelligent action in the world. But here, however, Reid's previous mistake also makes him wrong. It is incorrect to use the active voice only in cases of intelligent action. For instance, the rock smashed the car. I'm not claiming or thinking that the rock has any type of agency. If we talked with Reid's metaphysics in mind, we would have to say, God smashed the car with a rock. If we need to trace an intelligent cause behind a sequence of, at first glance, unintelligent effects, whenever we want to use the active voice, and there's no human agency in it to trace to, we have to mention God all the time. This is absurd. This implies that the active and passive distinction in language is a remnant from pagan days, that now we say things like the rock smashed a car because in ancient times they were used to ascribe agency to rocks, though we now believe no such thing is the case. I believe Reid is right when he claims that the distinction is universal and uses language as evidence of that, but he's wrong when he claims that that universal distinction is the same distinction he made in his philosophical speculations, that is, that active power is always intelligent in nature. 4. And lastly, language aside, mankind's daily business supposes or necessitates a conviction on this distinction. People must ascribe active power to other people so they can function in society. Again, Reid's philosophical speculations are getting in the way. Yes, it is right that everybody must suppose active power as Reid described it in everybody else, but this conscious or unconscious supposition is not the one ingrained in our language in the active and passive voice. It's like Reid is trying to graft his speculations into language. It kind of reminds me of presuppositionalists trying to make their philosophy pass as the gospel. But no, Reid didn't get this right. After this, Reid makes considerations about how pervasive is the common sense belief of active power, consequences of rejecting it, that is, how the world would be with no pervasive conviction in active power, and the difficulty and ridiculousness of doing it. It is difficult because we can hardly find principles to reason from more evident than those we wish to prove, and it appears ridiculous because, as this author justly observes, next to the ridicule of denying an evident truth is that of taking much pains to prove it.